The rise and fall of Rover is one of the most incredible automotive stories in history. Rover cars were once associated with quality, technological innovation and sophistication, from the P5's quality to the technology of the gas turbine Rovers, and the sophistication of the Rover P6. Rover was once the envy of the industry, the transport for royalty and prime ministers. But by early 2005 it was all over. The brand that once stood for quality had been degraded to the point of no return, with the mention of the name evoking memories of James May's Thai camera and the City Rover. In the greater public consciousness, Rover had become a shell of its former self, a punchline in jokes, a badge that had gone from the stately Rover P5, the car of prime ministers and royalty, to the City Rover, a rebadged Tata Indica. Throughout its long history, Rover has been a victim of several key factors that I believe cemented its downfall long before its eventual fate in 2005. This is the story of the Rover brand, its rise, golden era, and how a series of disasters led to one of the most fascinating downfalls in motoring history. Hello everybody and welcome to this video. If you're not subscribed already, please make sure to do so. It really does help me out and you get to see more of this. More history videos, more cars and conversions uncovered, and more projects like my Rover SD1 2600R and my Ford Cortina project. This video is about probably one of the most depressing and fascinating rises and falls in motoring history, the rise and fall of Rover as a brand. Drop a comment below and let me know what is your opinion on the rise and fall of Rover, and do you believe I've got this right? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to drop a like on the video if you liked it, but without further delay, let's get into the video and probably what is one of the most requested topics on this channel, the rise and fall of Rover cars. To understand Rover as a brand, we need to look at it through each decade and understand its beginnings. The Rover company began creating bicycles with its first, the Rover Safety Bicycle, in 1885. In 1904, Rover would adopt its famous Viking longship logo and begin producing cars, such as the 1904 Rover 8. The early half of the 20th century, minus the wars, was good for Rover. Its image had been cemented as one of quality, producing cars like the 106 Light Saloon. Financially, the company wasn't doing too well though, and after its 1920s restructuring and World War II, the post-war era for Rover would begin on a good note, carrying on its successful Rover 16, which had been launched in 1937 but paused thanks to the Second World War. The Rover 16 would be the template for Rover's success in the later years of the 40s and into the 50s, with its incredible quality, doors that clunked just right when closed, interiors trimmed in the finest wood and leather. The 16 defined the traditional Rover. Stately, grand, classy, and well built, a real car to aspire to. The 16's legacy would be carried on with the P3 series in 1948, the 60 and the 75. The brand had defined its values and was sticking to them. In 1949, the P4 would be launched, refining the values that defined Rover even more, a luxury mid-sized saloon. But Rover wasn't resting on its values, it was refining them to change with the times, a broader range, a bigger boot. On its launch though, the P4 would garner some criticism, with its styling being regarded as transatlantic, but in hindsight this was a good thing, especially with the way things were going in the market at the time. The P4 would be all the company values brought up to date for the new decade of the 50s, but Rover were on the vanguard of something fascinating. Gas turbines. In March 1950, Rover would showcase Jet 1, the world's first gas turbine powered car, a showcase of what the company could do. The Land Rover, a separate brand but part of the same company, was also doing well, forging a path for itself off-road. Jet 1 would be based on the P4 and would look very similar and be built in the same factory in Solihull by an independent Rover company. What better advertisement for the car it would be based upon? For the buyer of a new P4, a stately, handsome luxury saloon would now have the added cachet of being on the technical vanguard of motoring. Being so good it was used to create something truly forward-thinking and technologically advanced. Jet 1 would set the world speed record for gas turbine powered cars in 1952 with 152 mph top speed. Rover would win countless praise and awards for this pioneering achievement. The company that made cars with the Viking longship had really lived up to their branding. Bold, noble, daring, pushing the motor car into territories unknown. With the speed and innovation of Jet 1, the P4 and its noble yet modern appearance, and its daring yet hardy Land Rover, the Rover company was truly in its golden age. A golden age naturally would produce another golden car, the Rover P5, designed by David Bache. It would be sold alongside the P4 with its inlet over exhaust inline 6-cylinder engine. The new P5 3-litre would cement Rover as a prestige marque. Launched in 1958, the Rover P5 would be a hit with the gentlemanly older driver, something that at the time Rover was keen to distance itself from. This would fuel consistent improvements to make the P5 more sporting. In August 1959, thanks to the technical input of Harry Westlake, front disc brakes were added, and its 3-litre engine was revised, allowing the P5 to achieve 100 miles per hour. The P5 would go on to become an institution, a stately luxury saloon favoured by prime ministers and royalty in its later P5B variant. Rover would enter the 60s with a need for a new engine, but of course that wouldn't stop them innovating with gas turbines, with the currently in development P6, the replacement for the P4 being flanked in development by the gas turbine T4. The up-and-coming P6 would be launched in 1963 with an incredible backdrop, the T4 gas turbine, on which it shared some of the same design elements, with the T4 essentially being a P6 with a gas turbine engine. Rover that year would partner with BRM to produce a gas turbine powered race car. Rover in the 60s was racy, bold, modern, intrepid, noble and victorious. Victorious and modern with the P6, becoming the first ever winner of the European Car of the Year award, and racy with its collaboration with BRM, intrepid with the T4 and noble with its stately P5. In spite of Rover's achievements in the 60s, it marked a turning point for the company. In 1967 it would be purchased by Leyland Motors. The so-called foreign invasion was on the horizon, and only the largest car companies would survive. Rover would lose its independence in 1967, which at the time seemed like a good trade-off for strength in numbers. The bridge of the ship was now being manned by someone else, but it was on a good course, so minor deviations wouldn't have much of an effect. Leyland of course had enough resources to accommodate Rover, but it would have an awkward bedfellow, Triumph. For Rover this was fine, arguably it was more successful than Triumph, but with the premium car sector heating up in the late 60s, the two former competitors would have to compete and work under the same umbrella. This would lead to some infighting, which was all in good fun at the time. The main fight though was with cars like the Ford Zodiac, which had been positively destroyed with Rover's 2000 TC matching the 3-litre V6 Zodiac. Rover's near bottom end offering would make the highest end Zodiac in 1967 look incredibly overpriced. This would show in the numbers as well, with Ford building just over 15,000 of its Zodiac models, while Rover would build nearly 35,000 P6s. In 1968, Leyland would merge with BMC to form British Leyland. This would mark the turning point for Rover, and, as described by some, would be the beginning of the end. BMC would come with financial issues, yes, but its massive plants such as Longbridge and its experienced and innovative workforce would combat this one downside. For Rover, however, there would be another downside: Jaguar. Jaguar had merged with BMC to form British Motor Holdings 2 years earlier, and Jaguar would be yet another internal competitor for Rover, along with Triumph. Rover would have another problem. During the early days of British Leyland from 1968 to 1970, it would have a lack of boardroom representation. This would lead to Jaguar being favoured in most arguments, giving Jaguar an unfair advantage. This would lead to cars like the Rover P6BS, its mid-engined British V8 supercar, being axed, as well as its P5 successor, the Rover P8, an advanced luxury saloon with incredible suspension. But with the cancellation of the P8, the car that was supposed to be the next revolution for its maker had been lost. According to some sources, there was good reason for these cancellations. The Rover P6BS outperformed the E-Type Jaguar, and the P8 would have stepped on the toes of the newly launched XJ. Instead, the P6 and P5 would get a facelift to carry them into the 70s, while British Leyland figured things out. BLMC in 1971 was being reorganised, and again Rover, Jaguar and Triumph would be grouped together under the Specialist Division banner. Rover would begin development on their new car, but there was a problem. It would be pigeonholed. Jaguar would be placed at the top of the range, stunting Rover's upper market potential. Rover would be placed in the middle, and Triumph, who had previously occupied the same space, would be placed sort of in the middle, but not really. The fate of Triumph is a story for another video. The in-development 4.4 litre version of the Rover V8 would be cancelled, so Rover's new car didn't compete with Jaguar. This would mark the beginning of the Rover SD1. The top of the range would be occupied by the Rover V8 3.5 litre, with the two new inline 6-cylinders in development, the PE166, slotting underneath. But there would be a problem. The 2.6 litre version of the PE166 would be more powerful than the Rover V8. For the 2.6 to slot comfortably in the range underneath the V8, it would need to be sabotaged, with a less aggressive camshaft, smaller inlet ports and a restrictive intake manifold. This would solve the problem, at expense to the engineering department and the end customer. It wouldn't be the last time though the 6-cylinder would become victim of self-sabotaging British Leyland. The Rover SD1 just before its launch in the mid-70s was coming together, but British Leyland was falling apart. Strikes and more strikes. Management ordering 1,000 right wings, but no left wings. It was all beginning to come undone. The backdrop seen by the P6 on its launch was a world away. And Rover were the victims of these issues as well. The Rover car, once pictured as being built by the finest craftsmen, was now being left on the production line while people shouted outside. The civilised Rover had become tarred with the uncivilised strikes and mismanagement, all too commonly associated with British Leyland, and now, by proxy, Rover. The Rover SD1 would be launched in 1976. It was a revelation. One of the most incredible executive cars of the time, still looking fresh today. David Bache, Spen King and their team had done it. The next modern Rover, a worthy successor to the P6. The Rover SD1 on launch could draw parallels with a fish being taken from a pond and released in a puddle. It simply, no matter how good it was, couldn't swim. And this was due to the world it found itself in. As opposed to its predecessor being launched at a time of innovation, and when the Rover brand was in seemingly good graces with the motorist, the SD1 would be launched with a horrifying backdrop. The rider reports, strikes and build quality issues aplenty. The motorist looking to replace their P6 with the new Rover, launched 13 years after the last, would be in for a big shock. The Rover SD1 would be a sales success, being on back order for months after its launch. The motoring public, in spite of the horrifying BL reports, had bought into the Rover they all knew. The Rover that brought them the P6, the P5 and the P4. The jet cars of the 1950s, the Rover that they all knew and loved. But it wasn't as it seemed. The back orders were due to the popularity of the car, yes, but the main factor was the supply problems. Thanks to the strikes in the supply chain and in the plants that assembled the car, new cars would be few and far between, and when the customers finally got them, they would be flipped for a profit. At the time, quality issues would occur, but because of the sheer low volumes of these cars, they were fairly easy for Rover to rectify after sale. Production would continue to fail to ramp up, being 50% below target at the time with some components. And at a time of mass industry unrest and poor relations with workers, the last thing the people in the plants wanted to do was work harder, especially when management and supply chains could not provide the parts and tools needed to make their jobs as fluid as they should be. Production would eventually ramp up in 1977, with thanks to a night shift organised by Leyland. But while this was bearing fruits, another issue would arise. The delivery drivers would be next to strike, resulting in the SD1s building up and being stored outside. Now with normal cars this would be fine, but thanks to the sheer lack of quality control and the unsustainable ramp up in production, unmanageable stoppages and poor workmanship, SD1s were rusting in place. In 1978, SD1 production was halted again for 24 hours, after 6 inspectors walked out in protest at the colour of their overalls, according to AROnline. They were issued with brown overalls when they wanted white, and 40 other inspectors struck in sympathy. These strikes were widely reported, and with Rover's name attached to them, the SD1's image was beginning to falter. Customers weren't receiving their cars on time, and when they did, they were suffering issues. The SD1 would receive disappointing reviews by Autocar in long-term tests in regards to the awful fit and finish. One incredibly damning review by Car Magazine summarised the problem perfectly with the fit and finish, stating the finish of the boot looked more like a DIY job from Britain's most modern car factory. The Rover of the 70s was so far removed from the Rovers of the previous decades in execution, it ruined its reputation with brand loyalists and new customers alike, leading them to turn elsewhere for their luxury motoring. Now, this isn't to say there weren't some good cars that made it out the factory, considering the survivability rate today of the Rover SD1. As a car, it had problems like any other. The Rover SD1 on execution, though, was another story. It was, in its early years, a disaster, and with this, the Rover car's image was tarnished. By 1979, the quality problems were mostly resolved, but in an effort to keep up with the competitors with ease of servicing, Rover would do the unthinkable with its straight-six engines. Midway through the engine's life cycle, even though there were known issues with the oil passages to the head becoming blocked, Rover decided to lengthen the oil change intervals from 6,000 miles to 12,000 miles. This created the perfect storm, and with the average motorist at the time servicing their cars not exactly on time, the cams would seize, and the SD1s would get an even worse reputation. There would be another story though that would top this in 1979, which really did tip BL's image over the edge, and of course Rover's by association. In 1979, at the same factory the SD1 was being built in, newspapers would reveal night shift workers sleeping on the job, becoming one of the most notorious stories at the time, first hitting the headlines on November 12th, 1979. As a result of the Leyland dozers, the damage to the reputation of all brands under the BL umbrella was severe. The SD1 was also hampered by BL's lack of a competitions department at the time. In 1980 though, the SD1 would finally get its wish, being raced in Group 1, and then with the lessons learned, the Rover Vitesse would be launched. The car really would come into its own in the early 80s. But for the Rover SD1 it was too little too late. No matter how many improvements were made by Rover, the SD1's image was just too badly battle-scarred from the earlier issues in the 1970s. Rover in the 1980s, now under the Austin Rover banner, would find itself in a lost decade. The tie-in with Honda produced several great cars, yes, but no matter what Rover did, its name was still attached to the PR hellscape of BL's blunders in the 70s. The SD1 though was starting to recover, used famously by police and royal protection. This would be replaced by the 800 in 1985. With the previous issues facing new car production though, the Met Police would stockpile SD1s just before production ceased. This was done by the police so they didn't have to deal with the predicted early teething issues of the Rover 800. The new 827 Vitesse would grace the Isle of Man, with Tony Pond setting a new speed record, which took 21 years to beat. Rover were doing great things. Austin Rover's new beginning and reforms had worked, but the new and old generation of motorists were turning abroad, to BMW, Mercedes and Audi. Rover in the 80s, according to industry analysts, simply felt out of place. Another tragedy would befall Rover in 1988, Stagnation. After its purchase by British Aerospace, new models would be cancelled in favour of facelifts, but there would be one great thing to come from this new era of Rover. The R3200 would be succeeded by the R8 in 1989. The first car after the takeover would be Rover's best-selling, with 708,000 produced. The platform would lend itself nicely to the 220 Tomcat Turbo, which would take part in the Tomcat affair. But Rover's premium range was lacking innovation. The 800 would be facelifted, a car that was designed with a shelf life of around 5 years according to its designers at the time of launch. In comparison, the car that it was designed in tandem with had been through 3 generations by the time the Rover 800 had finished production. Rover's brand image, damaged by the 70s, was trying to go back to its former glory by reflecting on the past. Retro styling cues and a focus on craftsmanship, values that were of course true in its 90s lineup thanks to the new reforms, but were far removed from the public's perception thanks to the 1970s. Rover did begin to see gains in the 90s, but it was largely marked by stagnation in the luxury car sector. The ailing Rover would be bought by BMW in 1994. BMW knew that Rover were a brand facing issues, and to remedy this, they needed a new top-of-the-range car. Enter the Rover R40 program, the Rover 75. BMW would not selfishly remedy this issue for Rover, however. They would do it with strings attached. The Rover 75 would be awkwardly positioned size-wise to fit in between the 3 Series and the 5 Series, making sure it wouldn't compete with its parent company, and making it quite awkward for fleet buyers. Things were shaping up well though in spite of this. Rover's brand image had been given an extra boost, thanks to BMW's prestige. At the time though, a ghost of the past would set things back a touch. Thanks to Rover being an easy target, the Rover Metro's horrible crash test results wouldn't go unnoticed, further adding to the public's perception of Rover's uncertainty. At this time, the K16 would start to see some head gasket issues. Although widespread with sometimes less than palatable customer support, with Rover under the microscope, these would be portrayed as every single K-Series equipped Rover blowing its head gasket in unison every single day, while in comparison the current Ford EcoBoom saga is relatively buried. But with the public seeing BMW as the doctor for what BMW referred to at times as the English patient, it would give them the ultimate power over Rover's newly emerging image. The 75 on its launch in 1998 would be positively amazing. The press would love it. The public would love it too. And Jeremy Clarkson, for once, would love it as well. BMW's chairman, though, would unwittingly destroy Rover's reputation with one speech on the same day. On the afternoon of the Rover 75's launch, Rover would be painted as having an uncertain future, which for the car-buying public, no matter how good the press raved about the 75, the brand's past and now uncertain future made it a no-go. In 1999, BMW would break up the Rover Group, taking Mini and Land Rover, leaving the rest to be bought by the Phoenix 4 for a tenner. Rover's reputation was in tatters, but it was a patriotic buy. With MG Rover's new MG line, the Rover 25, 45 and 75 were modified to create high-performance versions, which sold better than their counterparts. Rover's brand image, however, had gone from pedigree to mutt, and no matter how good the cars were, this could not be changed in the public eye. Rover would find itself as the punchline on Top Gear and many other motoring shows, being perceived as a bit of a joke. The issue with Rover being the butt of the joke at the time is the workers were really putting in 110%, just to be knocked back time and time again. Rover, from its P5B, associated with the heights of British politics and royalty, to the City Rover, associated with a hidden camera in James May's tie. Rover was finished. In summary, Rover's downfall can be plotted through the eras of its existence. Pre-1967 things were good. A restructured Rover had its brand values and was changing with the world around it. Technological advancement, great cars and core values were established and refined. 1967 to 1972, Rover unfortunately found itself a part of the BL identity crisis. It was still a marque in high regard, however, but the rot had begun. Thankfully though for Rover and BL, its previous offerings could be updated to keep pace with the 70s. 1972 to 1975. Things were looking up. A new Rover to replace the still competent P6 and take the Rover car into the mid-70s and beyond. However, the SD1 was critical for both Rover and BL. The Rover SD1 was the first new Rover of the decade, and it was one that BL and Rover needed to get right. This is the car that their reputations hinged upon. 1975 to 1979, the SD1 was launched and executed horribly, thanks to the industrial action at the time. This left buyers without cars they ordered, and when they did get them, They would soon find out the time it took to get their new Rover was mainly spent striking. This is the critical point where I believe Rover's brand image was damaged beyond repair in the general motorist's consciousness at least. The buyers of the SD1 would have been both new and old, people upgrading from their P6s and other Rover cars. This would have left a sour taste in the mouth of their core base of customers, the brand loyalists, and the new customers alike. The bad experiences would turn these customers away, and they would make sure their opinion was heard. Their sons, daughters and colleagues would all hear about how bad their experience was with their new Rover, even if it was an isolated one. The reputation of the brand would then propagate through the generations. No matter what Rover did, good or bad, it would always have the same comeback. If it failed, it would be under the microscope. If it emerged victorious, then their past failings would be brought to the forefront out of spite. Rover at this stage really had their work cut out for them. Through the 1980s to 1994 and the BMW takeover, Rover was doing great things, but no matter what ground could be gained, it couldn't be recovered fast enough. In 1994, BMW would take over. This would boost Rover's reputation, but in 1998 it would set them back again. With the revelations and eventual sale of Rover to the Phoenix 4, BMW had essentially self-sabotaged their own partnership. Every step forward that Rover took, no matter how many, they would always be knocked back. Through fault of their own in some cases, but mostly due to forces outside of their control. This of course would all culminate in the bad reputation and near abandonment in some cases of the brand, with some parties interested in buying the company after BMW, even before the Phoenix 4, being uninterested in Rover as a marque, choosing to focus on MG. I firmly believe though that Rover lives on today, but within Land Rover, with their offerings still retaining the original yet modernised spirit of the Rover company in its golden era. Let me know what you think in the comments below. What do you think killed Rover? But as always, thank you for watching, keep watching and remember to subscribe for more of this, and I'll see you in the next one.